Hello and welcome to Adoptee Conversations from the Adoption and Fostering podcast. In this episode, I chat to Cat Theresa, an adult adoptee, and she shares her experience of being adopted in the late 60s. Cat describes her experience of growing up and the impact of adoption on how she felt as a child and adolescent. She went on to reunification with a birth mother at 19, then later with a birth father. She speaks about some of her challenges and the lifelong impact of being adopted. So please be cautious as she shares some difficult experiences that she had as a child. The usual warnings: if you have any doubts, get a friend to listen first. We hope you find it interesting, and if you're an adoptee and would like to share your perspective or experience, then please do direct messages on our Twitter feed or on our Facebook page.
I'm Cat, which is actually my birth name, which I discovered when I was about 18. So I don't go by the name of Cat usually, but I love it, I have to say. I love my name, Catherine Theresa. It's quite special to me. I knew I was adopted from when I was small, so I was adopted in the late 60s. I knew that I was adopted, but I knew nothing more.
Right.
And it just didn't settle for me as a child. Maybe there are some children for whom that would be fine. They would just, accept that without much curiosity. But I just felt curious all the time. I just wondered who this mummy was that was out there. And equally, my dad was as important to me as my mum. I thought, I've got parents there. You know, in the childish way, you imagine there's another mummy and daddy together.
Yeah.
And they've just given you, I probably thought that type of thing. But so I've always been really fascinated about adoption. Never felt comfortable about it. But interestingly, as I progressed through into adulthood, I pushed it all away. And so my husband, who I met 25 years ago, when I met him, he can remember the street we were on, walking down just when we were going out together, where I told him I was adopted. He remembers the exact street outside his rented house. And I told him, and he was, wow, he'd never met an adoptee. And he's a psychologist as well as I'm a psychologist too. So we're both fascinating people. So for him, this was really fascinating. Wow. And I did a complete denial. Oh, nothing at all going on. Nothing. I'm no different to you. I've got a mum and dad just like you have. That's it. Nothing.
Yeah.
It was all in a box, and it was packed in a box. And every now and then there was leakage, and it wasn't pretty.
So what did that look like?
I became very upset about stuff. I can talk about that in a bit more detail. Just at different times of my life, reunions, different times it leaked out, and the people around me were probably quite thrown by, well, we thought Cat was fine. She's sorted. She's one of the copers. I cope with other people's problems. I don't really like to own up to having my own. And then it leaked out. But it's only really now, I'm 51, maybe 48, 49, I started exploring it. So it's really new for me, this whole exploring adoption. It's really new, yeah.
Wow. I mean, that's interesting because often the idea that adoption is something that unfolds across our lifetime. It's not the story doesn't end. It continues and it evolves and it ebbs and flows. Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit about this little girl. I'm intrigued by this curiosity, and was it something that was was it a problem? What was your relationship like with your adoptive parents?
Well, I don't really remember much I don't remember being told, for example, but I do remember, or there's a family story. We actually don't know what are our own memories from when we're 7. And what's the repetition of a story. But the family story goes that we were watching telly. I've got an older brother who's also adopted, so not related to me, but I grew up with him. He was also adopted as a baby. So he's 2 years older. So we were watching Newsround. You're probably too young for Newsround.
No, I'm not. John Craven.
So John Craven came on with a news item saying, and today, for the first time ever, adopted people are able to get their birth certificates because of a change in the law. I think it was a Children's Act or Adopted People's Act or something.
Yeah.
So I was watching that at 7, and I said, yes, brilliant. I'm going to find probably said something quite hurtful, like my real mummy and daddy. Yeah. And so the story goes that my adopted mum said, well, we always knew you'd search. We always knew from that day.
Ooh.
so that was the story, and it almost gave me permission to search, even though I hid it from them. It was known in the family, whereas my adopted brother said, "I'm not looking. My mum didn't want me. Why would I ever look for her?" He was quite cross about it from very early on. So that was that was me really early wanting to know. And my adoptive parents are really, really, really special people. They're really lovely, but they're not emotional people. They don't talk about emotions. Right. They don't really. I was brought up without that whole dimension. So I never hugged my dad as a child. My adoptive dad, never hugged him. I mean, we never expressed love. He never said he loved me, but actually lots of people my age were brought up by parents who didn't say
cultural,
that.
Isn't it? They were the baby boomers, sort of.
Yeah, it's just different, isn't it? But we just never hugged. He's a very gentle, kind, intellectual sort of person. He wasn't brought up with parents, actually, interestingly. He wasn't. Right. He was brought up by extended family. He was brought up by his aunt. So my mum's always excused his behaviour to me and said he didn't have a parenting model.
Yeah,
he had a very strict aunt who brought him up. So I've sort of excused that. But equally, my mum wasn't emotional either. She just, if I was crying about stuff, adoption stuff was on my mind when I was a child. It was wash your face and come downstairs. Come on we go. Just
very stoic.
Very stoic, we just get on with things. So I was brought up not discussing it, not knowing where to put all these feelings about it, and also not knowing what to do with myself, because I was in this family with parents who just weren't emotional. Like my husband now says about my mum, she's just had an emotional bypass at some point in her life. And I was really emotional. I cried a lot. I feel as a grown-up looking back on me as a child, I was clingy. I really desperately needed reassurance from my mum, and I didn't really get it. So I just was troubled. I was troubled, but my older brother was troubled too, and this has been on my mind a lot recently when I hear about, because there's been stuff on, child to parent violence, and his story is his story.
Yeah.
He might come on one day and talk about his story.
Right, he's very
guy.
Welcome.
But he was very troubled, and the bit I know of that is my side of it, which is I spent a lot of time hiding in my room because he'd barricaded himself in his room, and there was trashing the room going on, and there was stuff going on with him and my mum and dad downstairs, and from what I knew, it was just a very frightening thing to happen. And it happened in the car, it happened out, it happened mainly in the home though. And I just knew I hid away, and I was frightened. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know where this was going. And then what would happen is my mum would come into my room and say, "Oh, come on now, you've got school tomorrow, so off to bed," or come on, it's time for your homework. But just buried it. We didn't sit down and
address it.
So I just grew up fearful of things kicking off, and I was the good one, and I felt I had to be the good one to keep things together. Yeah. And I also have this role in my life now, try and keep things together, try and keep everyone happy. And I know where it comes from. But so that was kind of a difficult thing. But then when I got to be a teenager, pre-teens actually, we had a big move from down south up north just after I'd started secondary school. And I think when I look back that childhood friends were massively important to me. I wonder if this is, it's true of lots of people, but I wonder if it's particularly true of adoptees. Yeah. Or for me it was that I formed these really close attachments to girls, one, sometimes two or three. And if something disrupted that, I couldn't do things. I would be fearful of going to school. I certainly wouldn't go to parties unless the best friend was there. Yeah. I just was very, very attached. So moving to a secondary school without my best friend was difficult. So I'd had that move down south where we lived. Then we moved up north in my first year of secondary school during the year. And I was the new girl in a new school, knew nobody. It was just really devastating for me.
Of course, yeah.
My old brother had moved too, and he was going through his stuff.
Yeah.
And in the summer term before my second year, I just was very, very unhappy, and I took an overdose.
Right.
I attempted to take my own life. I was just about to go into year 8. So I was 12, I suppose. So I sort of remember bits about it, but I had this really odd thing in that a friend of mine came to visit me a couple of weeks ago, and she brought with her these letters that I had written to her when we were best friends at university. Again, a really close attachment. I wrote her those letters, and it gave me an insight into that suicide attempt. I'd written about it at 18, 19 when I was best friends with her. But what I remember from my own sort of memories of it is that my grandparents came to stay for a bit of the time because my parents were both working, and they looked after me, and I really loved my grandparents. I loved them. This is my mum's parents, but I didn't feel entitled to them. That's a really horrid feeling.
That's a horrible feeling, yeah.
It is, and I felt all my cousins, who were biologically their grandchildren, they had more right to my granny and grandpa than I did. Oh. And I used to feel guilty that they would come, so they lived in Scotland. I used to feel guilty that they would come all the way from Scotland to London. I used to think my uncle was sort of disapproving of that, thinking it should be my children that have the grandparents, not those children who are the adopted ones. That's awful. So I did feel guilty about them, and I loved them. I loved my grandparents so much.
So was there any grounding in fact in that? Was there any sort of behaviour?
It's nothing. There was really nothing. But I created, I think that's what happens when you're confused and you're not talking openly about emotions, and I would never have said that to anybody. And then I created it. I created this feeling, in a sense. Well, there was nobody reassuring me that wasn't the case. So that was so they were looking after me, and I remember the feeling of relief. We drove, I don't know if you know, there's a comedian called John Shuttleworth who does these, talks about going to check the levels, elderly people going out to reservoirs. So this is what I did with them. We went out to a reservoir the day before I took my suicide attempt. We drove to a reservoir, and I remember feeling happy for the first time in ages. I was happy that I had a plan. Right. I had a plan that my life wasn't going to carry on. I was relieved. It was relief. But I was sad. It was the last time I was ever going to see them. But I had this plan, and I was kind of relieved that I wasn't going through it. But I didn't really understand what had caused that until I read this letter a couple of weeks ago that my friend came. She brought a huge pack of letters, and I really loved this friend when I was 18, 19, 20. We were really close, and we haven't seen each other for 20 years. So her bringing these letters was sort of wow. So we went through them. But at one point I came across this letter where I wrote to her and saying, I'm so sorry, babes. I called her babes. I'm so sorry, babes, that you're going through this crisis in capitals. So I was 19. Yeah. Crisis you put in capitals. This is a bit special. So I said, let me tell you about a crisis. Again in capitals, crisis I had at 12, because maybe it'll help. Yeah. So I told her, and what I told her, I was shocked. I wasn't shocked, and I was shocked that I'd articulated it so clearly in a letter at 19, because it was only 7 years old, that memory. But I wasn't shocked about what I'd said, and it was about the first person in the world didn't love me. Did she ever feel guilt? Did she ever feel bad about just leaving me and abandoning me? And I don't know why she didn't love me. That was a question with about 6 exclamation marks after it. Why didn't she love me? And then I came on to talk about my life day to day as a 12-year-old. And I said, all the attention in the family is going to my brother because he's stealing, nicking things, smoking, kicking off, and there's none for me. A very childish thing to say, but it resonated. There was none for me. And I said, nobody in this letter, I said, nobody understood me at that time. There was nobody to help me with what I was going through. I think I called emotions hassles. I said I had all these hassles in my head spinning around. No one helped me with the hassles. So I think when I was 12, I felt very, very alone because I didn't know any other adopted kids, knew no other adopted families. I didn't have friends because we'd moved. I couldn't talk to my parents because I just wasn't connected with them emotionally. And I just thought the only way out is to not be here, because this is quite painful, going through all this on my own.
At 12, that's just awful, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's quite upsetting thinking, my poor parents were dealing with frontline stuff, hardline stuff. They were. I don't want to put it all on, because they really had a tough time
holding the both of you in tension. With his kind of very demonstrative needs, but you just hidden away,
just
in the
hidden
shadows.
away. And I do worry sometimes it is the quiet person who is able to express themselves that actually is the worry. I was in that family. I was the worry, but I didn't have the people worrying about me because they didn't know, because I did such a good job of just burying it.
And I often read adoptees talking about sort of just playing this role, just being the person people need you to be. Yeah, I wanted to be that daughter that they would have had. And that both my parents are very kind of intellectual people. They're both medics. And I was so conscious that I wasn't bright. I wasn't like them. I wasn't interested in the classical music. It was always on in the background, and Radio 4. And I just didn't feel like I was doing well at school in the way they must have both done. And the conversations were intellectual. They weren't actually very child-friendly, because that must have reinforced the sense of difference, that I'm not their biological child. If I was their child, I would be having these intellectual conversations and listening to Radio 4. Yeah, exactly, totally. And I have dyslexia problems also. And I thought I couldn't learn to spell and read in the way that you would have done if they would have done. So there was a lot that divided us, in a sense, the emotional side and the intellectual side. And this desperate need for connection that I had, that they didn't seem to have. They seemed to be quite happy to sort of just not connect emotionally with their children. I had a desperate need for connection, and I parent so differently. Yeah. It's interesting. I heard that in another podcast from one of your other lovely adoptees that you've interviewed, and I thought, I am just that. I parented so differently. I'm so close and connected, and it's not actually easy being really closely connected to your children when they start then leaving. I'm finding that, but it is. I assess people to be foster carers, and we look at people's childhoods in light of what sort of parent are you. And it's fascinating to see that people either just fall into the same model of parenting, or they flip that narrative and become something incredibly different. But how the people make sense of that is really interesting. But I guess for you, all the way woven through is this golden thread of adoption, isn't it? Yeah. You see that's the sort of it's stamped into your DNA. Of how you feel about yourself and how you think about yourself. So I'm interested to know that how this kind of moment of crisis in your 12-year-old life, how did your parents respond to this, and what was that a moment of change? Maybe things changed that I wasn't aware of. I know my mum went into the school because I did have a problem with a PE teacher. I was quite dyspraxic as a child, a bit clumsy, and I wasn't doing well at gym. And I was upset about this PE teacher who bullied me. Well, she was humiliated. She publicly humiliated me in front of the class. And that was what I told my mum had led to because as soon as I took the overdose, I don't know how long afterwards, I panicked because I then realised I was going to die. And I told my brother. So was close to it, and he sobbed. He held me in his arms and he sobbed with me, sitting on the bed in his bedroom. The day before we both went back to school, but he also ran downstairs and got my mum, and the hospital was phoned about the dose of these tablets and all this sort of stuff. Anyway, I think my mum went into school. So I told my mum the only thing I could tell her, which was that this teacher at PE at school was bullying me. I didn't tell her all the other stuff about I'm not getting any attention. So how does a 12-year-old tell that to their mum? Yeah. I'm not getting any emotional connection. I'm not getting any love. That's what I felt, and I couldn't say. So I know that I suddenly wasn't doing gym anymore at school, which wasn't actually a good solution, because all the other girls, I went to an all-girls school, they just constantly asked me, why are you sitting by the side? But I never did gym again. That was that. And that was the answer.
That was the answer. But what didn't happen was I didn't see a psychologist. I didn't see anyone for any assessment.
No one scratched beneath the surface.
No, it was just moved on. And it wasn't that my parents were particularly averse to bringing in external support, because I remember when we lived where we lived down south, when my brother was having problems. I think he started having difficulties about 9-10. He did see a psychologist. So they were capable, understood the system to bring in. I think probably had to be privately then, but they were able to do that. So I don't quite know why, but it was buried. It was completely buried. We moved on. I actually just had to go to school. I was exceedingly tired because there were sleeping tablets that I'd taken. But I just went back to school. Maybe my mum tried to do things to help me with friendships. Possibly that happened. I wasn't aware of anything happening though. But things did improve in that I became friends with people and developed some close friendships, but it didn't go away. And so I self-harmed as a young teenager, and nobody knew that. I covered that up. It wasn't actually called self-harming in those days. There was no term for it. I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew I was hurting myself. I didn't really know why. I just knew it was a thing. I did. And I was so ashamed of it and so embarrassed. I didn't tell anyone. So I covered that up and just kept going. But I think my teenage years were different too. I think this need I had for this, like, seeking out of connection meant I was a bit I sort of kind of went off the rails, really. I had close friendships with girls, but then I really got into boys in a big way because that was a source of getting connection. Yeah, I had something there that meant I could, I could get those close connections with people. It wasn't a really healthy adolescence at all. I think my mum sort of dealt with it the best way she could. I mean, to be fair to her, she was fantastic at being certain things. So she was a really good parent of an adolescent who was going off the rails, in that she kept her home a really open space. Right. She wanted to be the house that I brought my friends back to. Right. And that meant she turned a blind eye to drug taking going on. She could smell it. She could smell when we were smoking weed. She turned a blind eye to it. She turned a blind eye to us smoking. Well, obviously that was a lower level thing, wasn't it? She turned a blind eye to the fact.
But it's the mid 80s. I mean, you're talking early 80s, are you? You're a teenager. Yeah. So still, even, what we would consider to be low level drug taking now wasn't then.
No, it wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't.
Very criminal behaviour and.
Yeah. And my friends used to think my mum was so cool.
Of course.
Just because it was a bit of a den of iniquity around
a safe place for them to go.
House. But she did that. She's told me later, always do that. Always do that when you've got teenagers. Make your house the house they come to, because then you've got an eye. You keep an eye on them. You know what's going on. So there were all these boys, different boyfriends I had, that she accepted, no matter how unusual they were. The guy with the Mohican, that was the kind of the end of the punk days. Yeah. She just accepted those friendships and those behaviours because she wanted to keep us safe, and it was her way. And she's also a very calm person, I have to say. I wouldn't be as calm as a parent. She's very calm. She's not really affected by anxiety at all. So she probably just thought that they're upstairs, they're doing their thing.
I know what they are.
At night, fine. So that was a bit of a thing, really, to be parented in that way. That was a good thing. It was definitely better us being safer, because if she been like the other parent, my other friend's parents, and said, no, you can't do these things, then we'd have gone somewhere else. We'd have been in the park, in the woods.
And all the dangers that inherent in that.
So that was a good side of her parenting. But from an emotional point of view, we just didn't deal with any of that stuff. And so I went to university really, really distressed, really homesick. I had a terrible first few weeks at university. I just cried on the phone to her a lot, because I just was suddenly uprooted again. I mean, I obviously had the confidence to go, but I didn't have the confidence to go down to the canteen on my own, so I sometimes would miss meals.
So again, isolated.
Yeah, people had gone without me because I didn't happen to be in the corridor at just that right moment. Yeah. So I was very anxious about all that. How do I get into the canteen? I had to be hanging around for a long time, and if I didn't, I missed a meal. So I was crying a lot down the phone to her, and she did this thing of saying she said she spoke to a psychologist that she worked with who said she mustn't come home for 6 weeks, because if she comes home in that time, she won't go back again. So I was told, you're not coming home. If you come home, I'll take you straight back, was what I was told.
Right, so kill or cure.
Terrible. And this story, I hear now. My son's going to university. I've been hanging around with my mum a bit, and whenever the sort of conversation goes around to him going to university, she'll say she tells anyone in the street, at her church in Sainsbury's, I didn't let Cat come home for 6 weeks because she wouldn't have gone back. I mean, she thinks it's a wonderful bit of her parenting.
Yeah, and look at her now. She's a success. It's all down to that.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, the lack of honesty is a massive thing for me. So she thinks, just like you said, oh, she's fine now. Look how she's turned out.
Yeah.
What she doesn't know is, to get to this place, I've had all that emotional turmoil. I was drinking an awful lot of alcohol when I shouldn't have been. I was engaging in some really unhealthy behaviours. I mean, I'm like the cat with 9 lives in a way.
Yeah.
I've come through fine, but I didn't need to come through with all of that turmoil and with all of those unhealthy coping strategies, had I been able to be honest and to be able to say, this really isn't working for me. And had she been able to have that emotional insight to see she needs something different. She needs a different model of parenting. Maybe
yes.
She will say now, if she hadn't pushed me, I wouldn't have been as independent as I am now. So I can understand from her point of view, she had a very clingy child. She's one of those children that clings around the legs at parties to the mum, will not separate. But the way you deal with that child isn't, you don't rip that child from the legs of the mother and plonk, and then the mother disappears, in my view.
Yeah.
You very gradually, you sit down, you wait until the child's ready to slightly lessen their grip, and then you suggest they go off and, little baby steps.
You maintain that safe base and you encourage that kind of that bravery. But do you think that I mean, this is a bigger question, that reflects perhaps in some respect maybe her personality, her own parenting strategy, but also advice that was given to adopters at that time, which was much like don't mention it, let's not talk about it, that'll do them no good, just crack on with your lives.
Quite possibly, yeah, I'm sure. And I'm sure they were told, adopting in the late 60s, that it's a fresh start for the baby. There's no information about the baby's first family, and that's how it should be. It's a fresh start, so you've got a clean slate. Don't
confuse the child. Don't focus on this stuff you can't resolve. Just get on with it. Yeah.
So really, they weren't, and there was no support for any post-adoption stuff. It was just not recognised that it could be an issue. So yeah, I think they did their best. And one of the funny things about this, the conflicting feelings you feel in adoption, is I feel massive, huge love for them. I would say I'm close to them now. I see them every week. I live around the corner from them. They come to my house for tea every week. I hug them now because I'm the grown-up in a sense of relationship. I'm not having any of this not hugging business. I told my mum in a text I loved her, and I felt that was a really out there thing.
Big step.
And she came back with a couple of kisses. Okay, it's fine with me now. It's fine. But the conflicting emotions are that I can hold together this massive amount of love for them, while also being really quite upset about the fact they didn't meet my needs. The two sit side by side because I don't expect them to be perfect. They weren't perfect, but they were really, really good enough.
Do you think that, and I'm aware I'm on thin ice, is that I think that there's an element of that in a lot of parenting, regardless of adoptive or not adoptive, that as adults we look back at our own parents and go, well, that didn't really cut the mustard. It was of its time. It was a kind of an outplaying of their own childhoods, of a very different time, war and all that, and we all come to this moment where we kind of go, well, we need to move on. Was it Philip Larkin said, if you pardon my French, parents fuck you up.
Exactly. Yeah. But I also think, I think you're right. You're definitely right, and it is good to accept the complexity of our own parents. However we've been parented, it's definitely a good way to go. But I also think, when I think about this in terms of adoption, it's that same complexity that I don't feel very happy with adoption in terms of the fact it took away my birth family, took away all of that from me and gave me no rights to that information growing up, and that led me to being very confused. That's not good. But yet I love the way that you get these special people in the world who open their homes and their hearts and bring in children who aren't of them, from them, who aren't biologically connected, because they say, well, we're not bothered about the lack of biological connection. We want a home, we want a family, we want to love a person, a little person, or two or three, however many. I feel it about foster parents, I feel it about adoptive parents. I just love the way that there's that really special type of person out there that says, blood's not thicker than water. What's all that about? No, we want to love a person. I love that, and I feel really, that gets me really. I feel really emotional about it when I was working with someone a couple of years ago, a psychologist who I really liked. We'd got on for a while. We worked together for a while, and she told me she was taking parental leave. Oh, right. I was thinking, there's no bump. Oh, parental leave. And she just quickly followed it up and said, she's been approved for adopting. And I was in a work capacity, so I was having to bury it all. But really, the tears were there. I just wanted to hug her. Because I just think, and I said this thing to my dad actually a couple of years ago. I said this exact same thing, how I feel about the way some people do this. It was on Mother's Day. I went to visit. Mother's Day is a really odd one. I feel really, really mixed up about Mother's Day, as I'm sure a lot of adoptees do, because I never once gave my own birth mother a Mother's Day card. And so that upsets me. I didn't have that relationship with her. And my adopted mum doesn't like Mother's Day. She just says, if you can't give me flowers any other time of the year, apart from that, then I'm not, she's funny about it. So we don't make a big deal out of it. I do sort of myself. So I was out there having a cup of tea with them. I was making a cup of tea at the kettle. My mum was off somewhere. And I said to my dad, I suddenly had this feeling, exactly what I've just said about these people out there. And there's one of them, my dad, standing in front of me. And I just welled up with tears. And I said, and my dad said, whatever's the matter? And I said, I can't tell you how I feel. And I want to tell you how I feel about you, what you did. You took in me and my brother, and you had no responsibility for us. You could have walked away. You took us in and you gave us this home and all this love. And he had said two things. The first thing he said was, well, whatever else would we have done? And I just thought, how humble is he? He wasn't taking me being all full of praise for him. He just said, well, whatever else would we have done? I said, well, I'll tell you what you would have done, Dad. You'd have travelled the world. You'd have had fabulous holidays with all, with your income just for you and Mum. You'd have gone all over the place. You'd gone to Australia, and they love travel. I said, you didn't. You went on walking holiday, really boring actually, walking holidays to the Lake District with me and my brother. You went to stay with grandparents. They were our holidays in the summer, staying in Scotland with grandparents so that we could see the family. That's what you did. And he said, but we wanted a family. He was so puzzled why I was so emotional. We wanted a family, was what he said. And I love that sentiment, because he wasn't saying, yes, we wanted to save you. Yes, you were a baby that needed us. He wasn't saying any of that. It was on him. No, they adopted because they wanted a family.
I mean, that's a complicated message, isn't it? Because I think that when you see sort of different narratives and different people's perspectives, different adoptees' perspectives, and again, I don't want to talk for adoptees, but people will often say that people wanting to adopt children perpetuates adoption, that the children become commodified, and I guess in different contexts and different circumstances and in different times that's true to different degrees. How do you feel? I mean, there's so much to talk about, because we've not even got to I read your blog for PAC UK, so I'd like to talk about that. But how do you feel about that? The different narratives around adoption, and obviously,
it's really some of it is really upsetting. I mean, there's a tweet doing the rounds at the moment that an adoptee's put up that I'm sure you've seen, which is about adopters in a support group saying, "Oh, we'd really like to adopt. We'd really like a baby, but we've heard there's quite a bit of trauma. Can we request a baby with less trauma?" And that sort of thing is so upsetting. I can't tell you, I read that. I'm sure lots of people feel like this. Lots of people who've been affected by adoption feel like this. It makes my stomach clench. It makes my head feel really tense. And I feel really, really upset about that type of view, that you can just pick and choose your baby to suit what you feel you'd like. Just design a baby. And actually, the reality is, even for babies, even for adoptees that were adopted when they were small, like 6 weeks old for me and my brother, but both of us had massive emotional issues from being adopted then. So we weren't, old. So all adoptees are affected by this loss. You can't get away from it. And if you're not prepared to get stuck in and deal with that, even though you don't know what it looks like, then you're definitely not going down the right road. It's not the right way of thinking about it. So some of those things are really upsetting when you see them. And also I feel really, really upset when I think about what adoptive parents are dealing with without support. I sort of can't quite believe. I can believe that adopting in the 60s meant you didn't get support in the 70s and 80s. When your child turned a teenager, started having problems, there was nothing. You would have had to brought it in privately, and it wouldn't have been adoption informed probably. So I understand that, but I cannot believe that things haven't changed. So I would imagine there ought to be, in my view, I think adoptees need someone with them all the way through, not therapeutically providing support all the time, but somebody that can be their advocate, somebody that can maintain a bit of a relationship with them, that can then bring in therapeutic services when they're needed. And I sort of imagine in my, dreamy cat world that there's fast tracking, that as soon as there's a suicide attempt or self-harm, or you've got a child that's really kicking off, you fast track through to psychological services that come in and start working with the family. That doesn't happen though, does it?
No, I have a friend who his child was had made a suicide attempt, and he was put on an emergency referral list. So that was 12 weeks.
Oh my goodness, that's shocking.
12 weeks is that ship has sailed.
Yeah, because what happens on the day to day then is it's those parents. They're the ones that are dealing with that. Not knowing is there going to be because the strongest predictor of a suicide attempt is a previous suicide attempt. That's not rocket science, is it? So you're going to be on tenterhooks thinking, well, we're the only people who are holding this child's distress. That's not right. That really is
it beggars belief for any child, and regardless of their circumstances, that a fast track is 3 months. It's just not. It's
not adequate at all.
Yeah. Can I draw you back to your story? Because I found your story of you being 18 and making this decision to access your files really interesting. And also it's kind of from another time. In some ways it's from another time. It's sort of pre-internet, pre-Facebook. So you made the decision to try and trace your birth mum. Is that right?
Yeah, and I did it all with a lot of anxiety about letting down my adoptive parents. That's one thing. I mean, I've kept some in my adoption sort of big file of stuff. I've kept some of the letters that I wrote to myself when I was doing the search and the reunion, and they're just awful. I mean, I thought I was a terrible person for doing this. I thought I was throwing away all the love that my adoptive parents had shown me, and that I was being disloyal. And I didn't need to feel like that. I mean, they had been supportive in saying, well, we know you want to, we know you're the one that wants to search. So they had been supportive, but they hadn't really sort of gone any further in a sense.
Beyond that, yeah.
So I suppose there was a kind of lack of talking about it. So I did it all just on my own, with my close friend at university helping me, and she was fantastic. But it was a really difficult thing to go through. In fact, I found my birth mother's phone number. This took months. It took ages. So there was all sorts of stuff that led up to that. But in the end, I had a few phone numbers of this surname, and I went through them one by one. And I lived in a student house that didn't have a phone that we only had incoming calls.
Yeah.
That was the thing for students, because they couldn't be trusted with a phone account.
It sounds like something from hundreds of years ago, but it's not.
So you had to walk. I had to walk from a student house around the corner to the phone box each time I wanted to phone one of these numbers. And my friend of mine came with me, and she was there, and I would be in the phone box. Oh, hello, can I speak to da-di-da? And they'd say, no, there's nobody here. I'd say, oh, okay, no problem, bye. And then I'd go back and we'd have another glass of wine to get my courage up
Fortitude,
to do the next one. So eventually, after about 4 of this, I got through to somebody, 4 of these phone calls.
So you were quite inebriated by this point as well.
Yeah, I was a bit.
Well-oiled.
Well-oiled. I got through to somebody who said, oh, right, she doesn't live here, but her daughter's here if you want to speak to her.
Oh, blimey.
So that's my birth sister. I was like, yes, thank you. Yes, I will. So the daughter came on the phone. I suppose she must have been about 15. And the daughter said, no, Mum's not here. Mum's never lived here. And I said, oh, I'm just a friend from nursing days, which I got a story so that I wasn't going to lie, but it wasn't too shocking. I'm not saying I'm birth daughter.
Yeah, it's a soft in.
It was a secret. So I said, I'm a connection from her nursing days, because my birth mum was a nurse. And she said, oh, right, well, I'll give you a number anyway. So there I had my birth mum's number. The sensible thing, maybe this was my friend, was I didn't phone her then, because I suppose it was probably a bit late and we were a bit far gone by this point.
Yeah.
But I celebrated. I had an actual phone number for this woman. It was all very exciting. Next day went round, and I phoned her, and I probably had needed a significant amount of wine again to get the courage up. So it was late by the time I phoned her. I mean, looking back, this was a disastrous thing to do for a person. Okay, and I then felt really guilty about that. But I was 19. I was in a muddle. I had a friend who just wanted to help me and didn't. So we did things that weren't sensible, like 9:30 at night. I phoned this number. This woman answers, who is my birth mum, and she said, hello. I said, I gave her my name, my adoptive name, and I said, I'm da-di-da, but you won't know me by that name. She said, oh, right, well, what will I know you by? I'm Cat Theresa. That's my birth name. And the first thing she said was, how are you contacting me? It should be a social worker. What are you doing contacting me? How have you got my number? She told me off. Well, of course she did. She was shocked. She was completely shocked that 19 years after, leaving this baby in a mother and baby home, there's a phone call out of the blue. I mean, just terrible, a terrible way to do it. But that's what happened. Anyway, she kind of managed to move on from that enough that we talked. And then we wrote letters, and then we agreed that she'd visit, and she visited, and she didn't hug me when I answered the door. She walked in, and I let her in, and we had a couple of days together of talking, and I felt I was with a neighbour that from 2 doors down I'd let in the house, and it was awkward. It was not emotional. It was a long way away from long lost families. There was no connection, and I was desperate for it. There was a 19-year-old that was ready to be hugged, that was ready to be scooped up, and I was ready for her to say, I loved you from the day you were conceived. I was desperate when I gave you away. I wanted all those things. None of it. She was practical. She told me the practical story about it. There was and she left a day early. She planned to be there for 3 days, and we were staying in a house.
That's really intense.
It was she wanted to stay in a B&B, and I persuaded her to stay with me in this house, and that was wrong. But that was me doing it on my own, which I shouldn't have ever been doing. So it wasn't the right way of reuniting at all. It was too much for her, and the fact that she left a day early was awful for me because I felt bereft. I actually, because there were no mobile phones, my friend, who was the one supporting me, knew, let's say birth mum was due to leave on the Thursday. She knew she was going to get a phone call from me on the Thursday saying, she's gone, I'm free, let's meet up. But she actually left on the Wednesday. Between the Wednesday and the Thursday, I was in bed, sobbing. I didn't eat, I didn't drink, I just had a glass of water, I went to the loo. I did nothing, just sobbed for 24 hours. I had no thoughts in my head. That's the other thing. I wasn't thinking anything. I was just in quite a distressed state, really.
Were you in shock as well?
I was in shock, yeah. And I actually wrote some journal things a few weeks afterwards, reflecting on it. And I'd reflected on how sensible I'd been, that I hadn't gone round to the corner shop and bought any wine.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was obviously a bit more mature at that point. I had some good coping strategies, which was just to go to bed and what have you, and then see my friend the next day. But it was really difficult. And we didn't have much contact for about 20 years, me and my birth mother, because she was nothing. It was like she was nothing to me. It was so odd that I was so desperate for connection, and yet she couldn't connect with me. I mean, maybe this is what I do. I thought maybe I was too much for her. Maybe I was too emotional. Maybe I was too intense. But
you're the problem.
Yeah, I was always putting it on me. And actually, I had therapy a year ago. It's taken me for that to work out. I can actually sort of think it wasn't me.
Yeah.
There's another person involved, and that maybe it was her responsibility to reach out and hug me.
Yeah.
You know, but there we are. That happened, and I connected with her. But again, this is another thing about the complexity of the emotions. I connected with her again 20 years later, and she didn't tell me information on my birth dad. Okay, she hadn't then when I was 19.
Yeah.
She knew it, but she didn't tell me. So I couldn't have a relationship with him. And when I met her the next time, I just had my second baby. There was a name in my social work records, and when I was 19, I said to her, "Is this him? Is it he's named?" And she just wouldn't tell me. She blanked. She just was very quiet. She told me very little. So I just went all quiet and da-da-da. So 20 years later, I gave her the name again, and I said, "Is this him? Because I can't find him. I'd been trying to find him all that time since I was 20. I was searching for him with the name that was on my social work records and his age and the fact she'd written he was a doctor going on to do surgical training. So I was looking through the British Medical Association stuff for a doctor at a certain age, all of this stuff. Okay. So she denied me that information at 20. Then when I met her again, she looked at the bit of paper and she shook her head and she said, well, it was the swinging 60s. That was it. That was all she would say about my birth dad. And I now know that's rubbish, actually. She wasn't with anyone else. He's told me that. He and I have had a DNA test. So he's completely my biological father. She knew that, actually. So I feel really angry with her that she denied me anyway. She didn't tell her husband she'd had me. She didn't tell her family about me.
And your sister, her other daughter?
She told her after that girl found photos that I then sent her when I was 20. Before we reunited, I sent her some photos of me, and that 15-year-old girl found them. And so she had to tell her about me, but she refused to let us meet. So when I met her at 20, the daughter knew, and I said, can I meet her? And she said, no, she's a teenager. She's got a lot going on as a teenager.
Yeah.
No. Then when 20 years later, I said again, can I meet your daughter? No, she's got a lot going on in her life at the moment. It wouldn't be a good time. Well, I didn't meet her until after birth mum had died. So she prevented me from finding these connections. Particularly my birth dad upset me. I feel angry with her that because we had all that wasted time. But at the same time as that feeling anger towards her, I feel huge compassion and protectiveness towards her because she was left to deal with pregnancy. She had 4 children and only one of them she got to keep. She had 3 baby girls that she gave away for adoption, and in every single case, it seems to be because there was no man. She wasn't married. Yeah. The guys left. Nobody seemed to have done an assessment of her capability to parent. She seemed like a capable woman. I mean, she was a nurse. She went on to do a master's degree. I mean, she seemed like a perfectly capable parent. And nobody seemed to think, that was relevant at all. Because she didn't have a husband, she couldn't keep her her babies. So I think I was the second baby she'd given up. So she was probably quite damaged by the experience of giving up her baby the first time, and probably wasn't going to repair from that, really. And so I think her letting me in on her life was just not going to happen.
So very like a wall of protection around herself and just the barriers up. But that doesn't change the fact that for you kind of had that rejection or that strain of relationship just perpetuated across those years. So so it sounds like you have do you have a better relationship with your birth father?
It's odd. It's developing. It's evolving. It was when I first found him, and I found him through social media, actually. So,
yeah,
to me, it's a fantastic thing.
Did he know that he'd had a child?
He knew. He came to visit me twice in the 6 weeks that she had me.
Right.
And he told me. Told me quite in a funny way. It's a funny story that he held me, and he said, "What are you going to do with her?" So there was a guy taking no responsibility.
Yeah, there is another question I can think of. What are you going to do with her?
Yeah. And that's another conflicting thing in my head. He left her and he left me, and yet I now love him. And I don't hold it against him because I understand he was a nurse doing his nursing training. He had no accommodation other than his nursing thing, accommodation. He wouldn't have had I don't know. He just he went on and he had a very chaotic, busy life. He wasn't going to be a father. So I've moved on from that sort of. I don't hold that against him. And but we when I connected with him, he was delighted. He was so excited. He was so welcoming. He was absolutely everything I wanted from my birth mother and from him, and I had it from him. So I fell completely in love with him, and we had a lot of Skype phone calls over a few weeks, and that he lives in another country. So I then took a flight and went to visit him, and he just welcomed me. He introduced me to a load of people in his life, and it was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. And I am so like him. I'm so like him in so many ways. He's such an emotional person. He can get to tears really quickly. He gets really anxious. The way he leaves the house. So my husband and sons have now visited. We've all visited him, but they came to visit on the second visit. And just seeing, we'd be waiting in his house for him to get ready for us all to be going out. Just seeing how he leaves the house. My husband was like, "I can't believe I'm seeing you in this guy." Because some people leave, my adoptive parents leave the house very calmly. They've got their bag packed. They're all ready. They know the back door's locked. It's no problem. There's no issue. There's no flapping. They just leave a house. I leave a house by, I'm in and out. I miss the back door. Like, have I got everything? Do you need a wee? I mean, I'll say to my grown-up, my 50-year-old female friends, "Do you need a wee before we go?" And they're like, "I can manage that myself." Yeah. But I'm flapping. And this is what my birth dad is like. He's very, very flappy. We both get very emotional very quickly. So suddenly and I look like him as well. I'm seeing myself in another person, and that's just incredible. My heart breaks for people that don't ever have that, and I know how lucky I am. I've had it twice. But our relationship got very complicated quite quickly. We had a year of it just being a honeymoon, and I fell in love with him. I told him I loved him. He tells me he loves me. He tells me I'm the most wonderful daughter. He just loves me back, and it's wonderful. And then things started to change because he is a born-again Christian. And I was brought up by Christians, but most people in my world don't know they're Christians unless they happen to say to my parents, "What are you doing Sunday morning?" You wouldn't actually know. Because my parents are those sort that they just get on with their own Christianity.
Very stoic and
they do really good. They're very compassionate people. They do lots and lots, but they don't make a big song and dance about it. They just do lots, and you know that they're really busy doing lots. Whereas he is a proselytizer.
Yeah.
Do you know that word?
Yeah.
He wants to convert people, and he doesn't. I was brought up with a very open view of sexuality. I knew my parents' view on sexuality from really early on. My mum taught me. Actually, my mum was involved in the adoption world as a medic, and she was involved in it at a time that gay parents weren't able to adopt.
Yeah.
So the first knowledge I have of gay issues is my mum ranting at home, I must have been, 13, 14, something like that, ranting because adoptive parents were being refused in the city we lived in because they were gay. They were being refused to go forward for the assessment process. And she went into a big rant about children need boundaries and love and a safe home and security, and there is no reason why gay parents can't provide that. And I know an awful lot of heterosexual parents that don't.
Quite progressive. And
I was brought up with really, really, really fabulous values around all those things. And then suddenly I've got this man in my life who I love and I'm very close to, who's telling me that homosexuality is wrong. I'm reading the Bible wrong if I put up any defence about all these Bible passages that he would say to me, he would rant at me. I'm reading the Bible wrong. I'm not doing this right, and I need to see the light. And we had some really awful conversations, arguments that I can't cope with because I'm not good at conflict.
Yeah.
And because I love him, and now suddenly it's all some really shaky ground.
This dream is there's cracks in the dream.
He let me into a lot of his views, and also views on it. I was brought up being really curious about other religions, and my parents travelled a lot and had visitors staying with us who were Hindus, and we had incense in the house, and they had different dietary requirements, and my mum was always interested in those things. She would never have had any disrespect for any other religion. And he's kind of got these anti-Muslim views that were shocking to me, that somebody I loved close to me would have. Just wasn't brought up in that sort of a family, and I've had to deal with this, and I don't know how to. And I sometimes send him quite curt messages. I want to get in there and get into the issue, and then we have a bit of a difficult exchange. So we've had a kind of difficult year of a bit where I feel I can't be with him unless somebody else is there. Our visits where it's just me and him and we're in a bubble of love, well, they have gone. I can't really be with him unless somebody else in the family, unless one of my sons comes, because then it tempers it down.
Superficial, or less.
Oh, my husband comes. My husband's great at taking him on all these issues. He's up for the argument, whereas I'm stuck sitting there with it all tense in me. I'm all wound up. I can't speak. It's just really difficult. And I also know I can't be with my birth dad now for more than a few days because he is too intense. The emotion that comes from him is too much. So, I mean, maybe we're just not, we probably wouldn't have been good being together as father and daughter.
Awkward teenagers. But does that then leave you sort of dislocated from both worlds? Not massively dislocated, but not quite here and not quite there.
Yeah, I felt that really acutely. I really felt that. And the thing that has really helped that feeling is when I've had little steps of telling my mum and dad, my adoptive parents, about what's going on with me and my birth dad, they have been brilliant. It's really, really, I didn't think I could love them more, but it has made me love them more in these last few years, because they've just been calmly listening and nodding and listening to this daughter of theirs sort of going to pieces sometimes. Yeah. And they don't quite know what to do. When I start welling up with tears about it, they don't quite know what to do. They don't come around and hug me. They just sort of do, right, okay.
Which is their model, yeah.
But they're stable, they're steady, they've taken it all on board. And the thing that has really, really helped is they welcomed him. They're not threatened by him. My birth mum, had I known that. Yeah. Had I known that, had I been able to explore it with them, they would have done. I know they would have done, but I just didn't know. I was too young at that point. Whereas when I told them now, and I said, maybe he'll come and visit me in my hometown. Obviously, my parents are around the corner. My mum said, well, he must stay with us, so I'll get the spare room ready. I'm like, I don't know. Do you not think that's a bit much? No, he can stay if he wants, no problem. So we decided he wouldn't stay. My friend's got a studio flat thing that he stayed in, so that was fine. I don't think my adopted mum would have been happy with him in a hotel. She'd have thought, no, he's family. That was her view. But it took me to sort of 49 to know that my adopted mum would have been like that about him. But she was really welcoming. So we all went out for a meal. We all went out for a meal together, and she said she wanted to sit next to him. So they sat next to each other. We'd already been round for a cup of tea first to do the sort of breaking the ice thing. And my birth dad was really nervous. And my adoptive parents were the ones totally hospitable, welcoming him in, lovely. And he said, my birth dad said to them, well, you've done a really wonderful job with her. It's really weird to hear yourself talked about in that way. I don't think I spoke during that whole 40-minute cup of tea, because I was just, I can't cope with these three people.
This world colliding.
In the same room. So I didn't really speak. He said, you've done a wonderful job. And my adopted mum said, well, we have you to thank for that. Oh. Blows my mind, really. Anyway, so they have been absolutely super about it. Really, really fabulous. Just in the fact of being so welcoming. So they've helped me put it all together in a sense, that I have these different bits that exist, and I've been able to tell them about the not so good bits about my birth dad, his very bigoted views. I've been able to tell them because, and without, they're also really good at not being appalled by it, not saying, "Well, he shouldn't be like that. He should, we brought you up with this way," because I felt a bit of resentment towards him, that he's trying to change me. He definitely wanted me to become an evangelical Christian. And I started going to church, and he gave me a lot of praise for that. And then I backed off going, and he was not so happy. So I felt a lot of resentment that he's trying to mould me. But they weren't like that. They were just sort of like, they were steady and calm. They knew the sort of person I was. They knew I wasn't going to be changed by him coming in. So they had no reason to feel threatened. They felt totally, we can share, we can open up. There's just more love to go round, and you've got this slightly odd character in your life now, Cat. But okay, we've all got oddnesses around us, and they've just been quite calm about it. I've been the one sort of ranting about him, and they've just been totally
sort of a safe base,
steady as a rock.
Yeah,
and it has increased. It has increased my love for them. I think they're just incredible people to go through that and not to feel threatened.
Yeah. Which I think is probably every I think as an adopter, that's a complicated thing that rattles around your head in different ways and at different times, and really complicated. Cat, you've been so generous with your time.
Talked a lot.
Yeah, but there's no sense of you repeating yourself. You've got real insight into a lot of stuff, and you've kind of you've been really generous opening up about really lots of specific things. So thank you so much. And people can sort of follow you on Twitter, can't they, at Cat Theresa, and I know you've written a guest blog for, is it PAC UK, PAC UK? There's a guest blog there which sort of unpicks some of that story about you meeting your biological mum, your birth mum.
Yeah. I think it's great that you're doing this, actually, and I've really loved having the opportunity to do it. I think it's really good to have adoptees have their stories out there. I think it's fantastic.
Oh, well, thank you, and we'll get this out there, and thank you so much for sharing your story.
You're welcome.
Thank you.